Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third session of our HS2 Archaeology Conference Day. And welcome to the Geoarchaeology of HS2. My name is Sam Fieldhouse. I'm Education and Community Manager for Wessex Archaeology. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play you a short film to introduce you to the route of HS2 and some of the archaeological findings that we're expecting to find along the way. So I'll pop that on and I'll be back with you in a moment.
The creation of HS2 is the biggest infrastructure project in Europe. The first new intercity railway to be built north of London in over a century. HS2 is being built in two phases. Phase 1 will link London and the West Midlands and is due to be completed by 2026. In Phase 2, the line will extend to Crewe by 2027 and followed by new lines towards Manchester and Leeds by 2033. But before we build bridges, tunnels, tracks and stations, an unprecedented amount of archaeological work will take place along the line of the route. HS2's archaeology programme is the largest ever undertaken in the UK. This once-in-a-generation opportunity allows us to reveal over 10,000 years of British history. Come with us as we take a train through time. Our journey starts a long time ago in the Paleolithic period, where early ancestors roamed in groups hunting and gathering food. Then settled and learned how to farm and discovered the secrets of making bronze and iron. We will then travel forward in time to see the mark the Romans left on Britain. From their straight roads and new systems of government to sanitation and town planning. Following the departure of the Romans, we head into medieval Britain. We'll see the effect the Black Death had on villages, towns and cities, and gain insight into how critical battles in the Wars of the Roses unfolded. The final leg of our journey takes us to the Industrial Revolution, where the landscape and infrastructure of Britain saw dramatic changes. Factories were built and the economy grew. In the 19th century, the steam rail network revolutionised how we moved goods and people across the country. In the 21st century, HS2 gives us a chance to do so again, creating a fairer, more balanced and prosperous Britain. Using the skills and expertise of an unprecedented number of archaeologists, all artefacts and human remains will be treated with the dignity, care and respect they deserve. And all discoveries will be shared with communities, retelling the stories of our past, helping us understand what made us as a country. The sheer scale of possible discoveries, the geographical span, and the vast range of our history to be unearthed makes HS2's archaeology programme a unique opportunity to tell the story of Britain, whilst leaving a lasting legacy for generations to come.
Marvellous. So without further ado, I will put on the pre-recorded lecture by my colleagues on the geoarchaeology of HS2. At any point during this, you are more than welcome to ask a question. And what we'll do is at the end, I'll ask my colleagues, Andy and Alex, to come along and they will do a live Q&A session. So at any point during the lecture, do type your questions in the question box and we'll answer those at the end. Thanks very much, everyone. I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Okay, my name is Alex Brown, and together with my colleague Andy Shaw, we'll be giving a short presentation on the geoarchaeological work that Wessex Archaeology is undertaking in the northern area of HS2 Phase 1. So this is primarily the area from Warwick to Lichfield and including Birmingham. Now, as geoarchaeologists, we're interested primarily in the soils and sediments, and investigating these can help us to understand how landscapes and sites form and change over time, and importantly for us as geoarchaeologists to understand the relationships between past landscapes and humans. In essence, we're taking the expertise from multiple related disciplines, so that might be physical geography or geology or archaeobotany and paleoecology, and using that information to inform archaeological knowledge. So between Andy and myself, we'll be talking about how the geoarchaeological work will hopefully contribute towards a better understanding of past landscapes along the route of HS2 and the communities that that inhabited these landscapes. So I'll give a brief introduction myself to the role of geoarchaeology on HS2, the ways, so some of the ways we identify areas of geoarchaeological interest, and then Andy and me will then present some of the initial results of fieldwork and the background to the work that we've been doing, some of the things that we've already learned as a result of fieldwork, and then moving forward, what the next phases of work will be. Now we're still in the fieldwork stage of the program at the moment, so this is very much a snapshot of work in progress. So that's one thing to bear in mind. So the HS2 phase 1 route runs from London through to Birmingham and then north to Lichfield. This covers a huge range of different geologies. So in terms of the bedrock geology, we're talking about the last 300 million years. But across that route, not across all of it, but in large parts of it, there are more recent sediments that cover the last 700,000 years or so. And it's these deposits that we as geoarchaeologists are most interested in. And we call these superficial deposits, and they represent a range of environments. So they were formed in a range of different environments in the past. And that may be from times when Britain was partially covered by ice sheets, or part of the landscape were a tundra landscape, to warmer periods like the one we're living in at the moment, when forests expand across Britain. Now, as a little bit of an archaeological background, the slide that you're seeing now shows the sequence of ice ages and intervening warm periods. So these are glacial and interglacial periods that have occurred over the last 1 million years. And together with that, the evidence for human occupation. Now, the earliest evidence that we have for human occupation in Britain dates to around about 900,000 years ago. These are from sites on the eroding coast of East Anglia. And there are periods of quite lengthy occupation, separated by substantial periods when we currently have very little or no evidence for human presence in Britain. Now, I'll leave Andy to talk in detail about the Pleistocene, but the point I want to make here is that the geographical extent of HS2 includes deposits that are going to cover almost the entire human history of occupation in Britain. And so therefore HS2 really provides us with a unique opportunity to investigate perhaps 750 million years of cultural history. So Andy is an expert in the geoarchaeology of the Pleistocene, which includes all of the Paleolithic, so the old Stone Age occupation of Britain, and my area of expertise is within the Holocene. So that's the current warm period over the last 11,500 years or so. So not only do these superficial deposits have the potential to contain and seal archaeological material, they also have the potential to contain a range of different organic and inorganic remains. And you can see on the slide here, so this is both plant and animal remains. There can be things like pollen and seeds, insects, snails. And these are important for us to understand past physical landscapes, the past vegetation and environments, and also past land use and how these have changed over timescales of hundreds to thousands of years. So this isn't just about painting a pretty background for the archaeology, so it's not just about having nice reconstructions, but it's about using the widest range of suitable scientific techniques to inform on the archaeology. So it provides an environmental and a landscape context for the archaeology. It's about the places that people chose to live. It's what these places may have looked like, how people were able to move around the landscape, how they may have even perceived that landscape, the sorts of resources that were available to people based upon the vegetation evidence that we might have, and importantly, how our ancestors may have modified their environments. So in terms of the specific role that HS2 or geoarchaeology plays in HS2 rather, this has multiple stages. So one of the critical components focuses on identifying locations along the route that may represent a risk to the project. So by risk, I mean that there are locations where we know deposits are present that have or are likely to have a geoarchaeological or an archaeological potential, or there are locations where we lack sufficient information on those deposits to accurately understand that potential, and that represents a risk to the project. So where there's construction that is likely to impact on their deposits, our role is to design appropriate strategies that target those locations, that allow us to examine the sediments, more precisely determine that potential, and that may include taking samples, and then we can recommend these samples and these sites for later analysis, and that can ultimately contribute towards mitigating any impact. Now, along the northern section of HS2, we've identified a series of sites, so about 18 or 19 of them, where we're undertaking geoarchaeological works to precisely determine that potential. And you can see them on the screen here, coloured in blue, located along the route. There's some of these this might not include some additional sites that we've added to this program, where the program of archaeological mitigation and evaluation has actually identified sites that we didn't initially pick up. So what I'm going to do now is pass over to Andy, who will talk about some of the Pleistocene deposits and the Paleolithic period, and then I'll follow up with a little bit more on the Holocene. So over to Andy.
Thanks, Alex. So my name's Andy Shaw, and I'm an expert in the archaeology and geoarchaeology of the Paleolithic and Pleistocene period. So half of the geoarchaeological works we're undertaking on the HS2 project relates to what's often termed the Ice Age. This is a period which, in reality, is characterized by alternating interglacial periods with similar climate and environments as today, and colder periods during which glaciers extended over much of northern and central parts of Britain. Technically, this period is what is referred to as the Pleistocene. It's associated with archaeology from the Paleolithic period. The Paleolithic occupation of Britain is now known to extend from at least 850,000 years ago to around 12,000 years ago, and it's subdivided traditionally between the lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic. Now, as this slide shows, when considered in terms of the entire human history of occupation in Britain, the Paleolithic covers the vast majority of time humans have ever been present in Britain. So it's a huge period of time over which there were many changes both within the landscapes and within the human populations occupying Britain. So what I'm going to do first, to put our work investigating the Pleistocene and the Paleolithic along the HS2 route into some context, is I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the period as a whole. So, during the Pleistocene, the geography and landscapes of Britain were very different than what they are today. These slides show how the geography of Britain looked at different periods during the Pleistocene, and it also shows some of the key Paleolithic sites from the different periods. The first image we're looking at now shows a reconstruction of the paleogeography of Britain around 600,000 years ago. At this time, Britain was connected, regardless of changing sea levels, to northern Europe via a land bridge which extended across the Straits of Dover. Now, that land bridge is thought to have existed in some form up until 150,000 years ago, maintaining connectivity between Britain and the continent. The second image shows Britain during the Anglian glaciation, when glaciers radically altered the river systems previously represented, wiping out several major rivers, including the River Bytham, which flowed across the English Midlands and East Anglia, and is a river that we deal with as part of the works we're doing on HS2, And it also diverted the course of other major rivers, including pushing the Thames further south. The third slide shows the situation around 200,000 years ago, immediately prior to the final breaching of the Straits of Dover. After this period, Britain was no longer had a permanent connection to continental Europe. The final slide shows the situation around 60,000 years ago, by which point the UK was only accessible to humans and animals across the North Sea during periods of low sea levels. So from this point onwards, it required sea levels to be much lower than they are today to allow people and animals into Britain. During these different periods of the Pleistocene, the environments and animal communities within Britain varied dramatically. During warm interglacial periods, we see species such as elephant, hippo, and macaque in the British Isles. In contrast, during cold periods, we see completely contrasting species such as reindeer, woolly mammoth, and woolly rhino being present. During these different periods of the Pleistocene, Britain was occupied by changing human species. So not only did the animal communities change, but the species of human within Britain changed as well. The earliest occupants during the lower Paleolithic may have belonged to a species which is termed Homo antecessor. Currently, although we have stone tools belonging to this period in Britain, we don't have any actual human fossils. However, what we do have are these remarkable human footprints preserved within soft sediments at Haysborough in Norfolk that date to around 800,000 years ago. During the late Lower and Middle Paleolithic, Britain was occupied by Homo heidelbergensis and their descendants, the Neanderthals. We have remains of both these species from sites in the UK. This includes the Swanscombe skull from North Kent and this human tibia from Boxgrove in Sussex, both of which you can see on this slide. Finally, during the Upper Paleolithic, anatomically modern human populations emerge and spread into Britain. On this slide, we can see a reconstruction of the burial of the Red Lady of Parvaland, which was in fact we now know was a male Upper Paleolithic burial, which dates to approximately 30,000 years ago. So not only do the species change during the Paleolithic, but the archaeology associated with them changes quite dramatically. And this archaeology also reflects great changes in human behavior. Now, these differences and changes are now known to be quite complex. However, in broad terms, the archaeology of the Lower Paleolithic is characterized by these large cutting tools termed hand axes. Later, during the Middle Paleolithic, the archaeological record sees the appearance of a particular method of shaping blanks, termed cores, to enable the removal of flakes of a predetermined size and form. This is termed Levallois flaking and is often associated with the Neanderthals. On this slide, we can see a Levallois core and its desired end product, a flake. So the core is shaped to produce a flake of that particular form. Finally, during the Upper Paleolithic, stone tools assemblies are characterized by the production of prismatic blades, which are used to produce armatures for hafted implements. So that just gives you some background to the Paleolithic and the Pleistocene as a whole. Going back to the actual work that we've been doing as part of HS2, the HS2 Phase 1 North route crosses a range of Pleistocene sediments, which have principally been laid down by rivers, within lakes, and by glaciers. Such deposits have the potential to contain lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic archaeology, along with environmental evidence that can be used to reconstruct the landscapes and environments within which different human groups and different human populations and indeed different species lived. Specifically, what we're looking at as part of Phase 1 North is an area of the English Midlands, which is known to preserve Pleistocene sediments, which may be as old as 700,000 years ago, going through to around 12,000 years ago. So what we have are deposits potentially across the route, which cover much of the Paleolithic period. However, these sediments are sporadically and patchily preserved. They're not preserved everywhere. They've been eroded and impacted on, particularly during glacial periods, so they're only preserved within specific parts of the modern landscape. Additionally, within this area of Britain, the Paleolithic and these deposits are have only had limited previous work, and therefore our understanding of them is limited. So the principal aims of the Pleistocene geoarchaeological work that we've been doing is to establish where different Pleistocene deposits are along the route and where they are not, where they're not preserved, to try and establish the ages of these deposits, so to establish which period of the Pleistocene and Paleolithic we're dealing with, to consider the potential of these deposits to preserve archaeological evidence, and to recover samples from appropriate deposits to look for environmental evidence. So that's the basis of the work that we've been doing. How then have we been trying to do this? Well, the first stage of the process that we've gone through is to look at data from ground investigation works, so principally boreholes. And the purpose of this has been to see where Pleistocene deposits may be present and delimit areas for subsequent investigations. What we've got before you now is an example from the River Bytham. Here, the ground investigation data shows that the deposits of the River Bytham are present beneath varying deposits of later material deposited by glaciers and as glacial outwash. So the River Bytham itself was a river system which crossed the area prior to 470,000 years ago, after which it was wiped out during the Anglian glaciation, and certain sediments were totally eroded away and others were buried by later glaciogenic deposits. But these deposits, these fluvial river-laid deposits of the Bytham are known to be associated with important lower Paleolithic archaeology and environmental evidence. So there are a set of deposits we've specifically targeted to investigate. In all the geoarchaeological investigations we've been carrying out as parts of the HS2 work, we've basically used two techniques, sometimes singularly, and in this case, in a combination. The first technique we've been using is digging test pits using a machine. These are carried out in areas where deposits of interest are less than 4 meters below the ground surface. The advantage of these is that they both allow us to record and assess the deposit and consider how they were deposited, and to take samples of deposits and sieve them to see if they contain Paleolithic archaeology. We're also able to take bulk samples while we do this from deposits which might preserve environmental remains and which we can subsequently assess. The second technique we use is boreholes. The key advantage of this is it allows us to investigate more deeply buried deposits, so deposits which are found below 4 meters below the ground level. What we can do with these, it allows us to record the deposits and assess how they were laid down, but also to take sealed samples to see what environmental evidence are preserved within the deposits. Currently, all our investigation works are ongoing. So what I'd like to just talk about now is some of the things that we have found, but perhaps principally the things that we're hoping to find. So firstly, we're looking for Paleolithic archaeology. Now, Paleolithic archaeology is relatively rare in historic collections from this area of Britain, so along the Phase 1 North route. Paleolithic archaeology generally is much more commonly found further south. However, this is known to at least partially reflect a bias of previous research. So in effect, there's been much more research on the Paleolithic in southern Britain than there has in the English Midlands. And that at least partially reflects the imbalance in the archaeological record. This slide shows a flint Lower Paleolithic hand axe found within one of our sites in the Avon Valley. The second is an historic find of an andesite hand axe. Andesite is a particular volcanic rock. This comes from the site of Waverley Wood, and it's a site associated with the River Bytham, which is found close to the HS2 route. Secondly, we're looking for dating evidence. Dating deposits is key to establishing a chronology of the Pleistocene deposits along the route, and for establishing the age of any new finds, but also pre-existing but undated Paleolithic finds known from equivalent deposits in the area. For the Pleistocene, there are a range of methods that you can use to potentially date deposits. Two of the principal methods are through the use of evidence of fauna known to only have been present in the UK at particular periods. This is a technique known as biostratigraphy. Another technique that we'll be using is called OSL dating, optically stimulated luminescence dating. This utilizes quartz and feldspar crystals to measure the last time they were exposed to light. So it can measure how long ago that was and thus give us a relative age. As part of the next phase of our work, we're also going to be assessing the environmental samples that we've been taking to see what evidence they preserve and what it can tell us about Pleistocene landscapes and environments. This evidence may include mammalian faunal remains. The type of remains you could get can vary greatly in size. So you could have elements of large megafauna, such as this mammoth, but on the other scale of things, you can also have micro mammalian remains, such as these vole teeth. Both of sets of data are important about telling us what species were present at particular times and what environments were like at particular times. Another thing we're going to be looking for is snails. These are good indicators of environments and can sometimes provide evidence that can be used to date deposits. Also, if organic remains are present, we'll be looking for things like beetles. These are often associated with particular climatic and environmental conditions. They're quite good environmental indicators. Also, they can be used to recreate what seasonal temperatures were like, so what the mean summer and winter temperatures were like at a particular place. So they're very useful for that. As well as faunal remains, we're also going to be looking for evidence of what the vegetation was like in particular places at particular times. And evidence for this can include pollen. These are some pollen grains, and these can be preserved in particular kinds of sediments. Also, in terms of vegetation, in some instances where organic deposits and organic remains are preserved, you can get macroscopic plant remains like these shown on this slide. So, just to conclude, the geoarchaeological works we've been carrying out as part of HS2 Phase 1 North is enabling us to accurately identify where along the route Pleistocene deposits are present and where they're not present. The sampling we're currently carrying out will enable us to date these deposits, establish where significant Paleolithic archaeology may be present, and to recover environmental evidence. The Pleistocene deposits and the evidence they contain reflect over 500,000 years of environmental and landscape change in the English Midlands and within the UK as a whole. The results of the work will enable us to expand our understanding of the Paleolithic archaeological record of the English Midlands and to gain new insights into the Paleolithic settlement history of the region as a whole. So that's what we're hoping to do in terms of the Pleistocene. Now I'm just going to pass back to Alex to discuss what we're hoping to achieve when looking at the Holocene sediments.
Great, thank you very much, Andy. I think that was really useful, especially in highlighting the technicalities of how we're actually investigating these sites and why we're investigating them, because actually a lot of that applies equally to the Holocene, except we're not using test pits for the Holocene. It's almost exclusively boreholes, but we're looking at the same sorts of environmental indicators, keen on dating the deposits and relating that to human activity. So I'm going to cover the Holocene components of the geoarchaeological work, and the Holocene is the period that we live in at the moment, although obviously there's a lot of debate at present, particularly in the geological community, about whether we're no longer living in the Holocene, but we're actually living in the Anthropocene. But I'm just going to call it the Holocene for the sake of simplicity. And that's the most recent geoarchaeological, or the most recent geological epoch, rather, that covers the last 11,700 years since the end of the last ice age. So this is when temperatures rise quite significantly, and the more open landscape you can see in this slide on the bottom right would have been a landscape of sort of tall and short grassland with some shrubby trees, would have changed into a landscape of woodland. And there's some evidence that the shift between the last ice age and the current warm period happened in as little as 20 years. It was a very rapid shift. So at the stage we're at the moment, we're still in the process of investigating sites. So we've looked at some sites, we've retrieved boreholes, but we've got a couple of sites left still to investigate. We haven't started assessing any of this material, or importantly radiocarbon dating it. So although we can make some informed decisions and estimates on the dates we think some of these sediments might be, we don't know precisely the date of these deposits. So that's something to bear in mind. Now, as geoarchaeologists, we're interested in the relationships between humans, landscape, and environment. And there's obviously a huge difference between a landscape 11,500 years ago, or 6,000 years ago, or 4 or 2,000 years ago, or today. So the date of the deposits really has a bearing on the sorts of research questions that we want to ask about these deposits. Now, these can be route-wide questions. There's a whole overarching document that has a whole series of really useful research questions that help us to guide these works. And some of these are questions that geoarchaeologists across the entire route are seeking to answer, or they could be things that are more focused on a specific area, like the northern part of HS2 that we're working in, or very specific sites. So that's something that we bear in mind. Now, as a little bit of a background to the archaeology of the Holocene and some of the things that we may be looking at, this isn't sort of an exhaustive coverage, but half of the Holocene is covered by the Mesolithic period. So these are hunter-gatherer communities that would have been living from about 11,500 years ago to 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC. So these are largely mobile communities, hunting, gathering, and fishing. Now, we have a significant amount of evidence that these communities manipulated their environment. So they were making clearings in woodland, burning and making clearings along the woodland edge and within wetland habitats. And this seems to have been part of a strategy to increase the productivity and the predictability of resources through the years. So on this slide, you see some images here of berries and animals and wetland areas. In wetland areas, if you burn the vegetation at particular times of the year, you can actually create clearings, and wildfowl quite like that. So you can hunt that wildfowl, or it actually increases the productivity of the plants that are growing in wetlands, and you can use that for the reeds, for example, for building structures to live in. And if you're burning along the woodland edge, you could be creating areas where berries and other food resources have an increased productivity in following years, and they ripen at particular parts of the years. So you know that there's a specific part of the landscape where you've got a guaranteed food resource. And these clearings also are attractive to animals like deer that you can hunt. So they were very adept at understanding their environments, the movement of resources when they were available, and manipulating their environment in order to increase the productivity and predictability of those resources. And we have a huge amount of evidence from that, from the Mesolithic, from both upland and lowland landscapes and from different parts of the year. So a lot of the focus of our work in HS2 is on the watercourses that HS2 crosses. And it's these watercourses that are very likely to have been foci for past communities who would have used them as routeways through the landscape, but also as places where abundant plant and animal resources will have been concentrated. Now, 6,000 years ago, we have the transition from hunter-gatherer to farming lifestyles. So we have the emergence with the Neolithic of new artifact types, monuments, but also a really important shift in the relationship between humans and their environments. People are growing domesticated plants, crops, and they're husbanding domesticated animals. Now, in terms of the impact on the environment, in the early Neolithic, we're still seeing a largely wooded landscape. Now, there are a lot of regional variations in this pattern. Just as a function of this talk, it's difficult to sort of highlight too much of that variation. So there's some areas that see more clearance than others, and other areas that see a maintenance of these woodland environments. And quite a lot of agriculture in the early Neolithic seems to have been occurring in temporary clearings on a shifting basis. So no field boundaries. There are some in some sites, places in Ireland, for example. And we have a lot of evidence for some continuity in hunter-gatherer lifeways into the Neolithic. So where we have deposits of this date that are of Neolithic date, or even if they cover the transition between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, it will allow us the opportunity to investigate this evidence for change and continuity, both in the way people were living, the places people were living, and their subsistence strategies. And it's not really until towards the end of the Neolithic, so perhaps around 2,500 BC, that we start to see a more substantial clearance of woodland across Britain. So that by the time you get to the early Middle Bronze Age, here we're talking probably about 1800 to 1500 BC, we're looking at a substantially cleared open landscape. So obviously with some areas having more woodland than others, but one where we see the development of field boundaries and settlements. So a landscape that actually we wouldn't have any difficulty with identifying today. So although the Neolithic is important in that transition from a hunter-gatherer to a farming lifestyle, in my opinion, the Bronze Age is where we really see a fundamental and lasting change to the characteristics of the British landscape, and that persists beyond the Bronze Age through the Iron Age, the Roman and the medieval period and to today. And it's during this time that we see a lot of activity in rivers. So we see increased sedimentation, the expansion of floodplains, the creation of new river channels. Lots of earlier archaeology is submerged and preserved below these floodplains. And we see this happening during these periods from the Bronze Age onwards. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to recover material from these periods, from these river valleys, and it can help to inform about the relationships between people and their environments. Very important for us not to see the archaeology and the communities as separate from the landscapes that they were inhabiting. And that's one of the really important things that our work can do. It can provide that information. So one area to touch on with the Iron Age and the Roman period is that beyond recovering samples that can inform about those past landscapes, there's also questions about the role that the Romans had in altering the landscape of Britain. There's, again, quite a lot of variation in this evidence across Britain. So areas in the southeast of the country where there's evidence that it was a largely open, agricultural, well-settled landscape in the Iron Age, and there doesn't seem to be a clear horizon of impact from the Romans, as opposed to areas of Wales and the western parts of Britain and the north as well, that may have retained more woodland, and we see clearance in the Roman period. And the same is true at the end of the Roman period and into the early medieval period, when, for the early medieval specifically, we have quite a lot of the landscape of Britain where we don't have a lot of archaeology for this period. So the environmental evidence is actually really important in us understanding continuity from the Roman period into the early medieval or the Dark Ages. Do we see evidence for reforestation in the landscape, or do we see a continuity in that open environment and evidence for agriculture? Now, I think one of the sort of the key points to make with these deposits that we're finding in these river valleys is that there's the potential to cover material that extends anywhere between the Mesolithic, so on the left, hunter-gatherer communities living and exploiting the edges of rivers, right through to the Industrial Revolution. So really, as this work proceeds, we'll be able to refine the dates of those deposits and also refine the specific research questions that we want to answer, or that we think that we can contribute towards. It's worth bearing in mind as well that human activity is occurring against background climate fluctuations during the Holocene. It's not simply a case that the environment is cold in an ice age and warm in an interglacial. There's a lot of fluctuation in climate. So there would have been little colder periods or warmer periods, and it's important to understand the environmental evidence that we have in the context of this climate. So I'm not suggesting that we'll be producing this paleoclimate data, but we'll be able to set the environmental data that we have in the context of climate. So, for example, on on this slide, you can see the climate variation during the Roman period through to the present day. So there's actually, during the earlier part of the Roman period, a warm period. You then have some climate deterioration towards the end of the Roman period. In a lot of coastal areas, we see a lot of flooding and abandonment of areas that had previously been recovered from the sea. We have a thermal maximum during the medieval period, the early medieval period, at about 900 AD, and then many of you may know about the Little Ice Age, which is actually a series of 5 much colder snaps between about the mid 14th century and the mid 18th century. So we have that in the back of our mind in informing our data. So I did mention earlier about how the focus of a lot of our work is on the watercourses and the floodplains that HS2 crosses. Some of these are fairly large rivers. You can see on the bottom of this image, you've actually got the River Blythe. This is from a location to the south of where we're working, but you can see how the flooding is extending across the floodplain. This is very much how it would have been in the past, but we're looking at smaller rivers as well, down to very small watercourses that might just be a couple of meters across, but they have floodplains associated with them that we can investigate. Now, what we're really interested in are the organic sediments that are preserved in these environments, so peat. Now, peat is the remains of plants and vegetation communities that have died and been preserved in waterlogged, oxygen-free environments that has formed peat. So it's all that organic remains, and they contain a lot of microscopic and macroscopic plant remains, the sort of things Andy and me have been talking about early in the talk, and they can tell us about the past environment, the vegetation, climate, and land use. And you can also tell a lot about the environments just from the physical sediments themselves. So the image in the top left, this isn't actually one of the cores that we've taken, but you can see the dark material is the peat, and then we have this lighter sediment, this bluey grey sediment. So this is actually a site from the Thames that are sediments that were deposited under rising sea levels, and they represent sort of salt marshes and mud flats, and then periods of sea level decline or stability where wetland plant communities, semi-terrestrial plant communities, start to encroach on those mud flats and salt marshes, and those peat communities start to build up. And then you have phases where that peat stops forming and silts are deposited back on as sea level is rising faster than the peat is accumulating, and it's overtopped. Now, it's different in river valleys, because you might have a peat that's forming very localized within a floodplain, or it's forming within a channel that's no longer active and cut off from the main river. And you may have phases of increased flooding that cut off that peat and start to deposit silt again. But those are the sorts of deposits that we're really interested in. Also importantly, because the peat is something that we can radiocarbon date. We can't radiocarbon date plant remains from the silts because they're waterborne. We don't really know where that material has come from. It could have come from anywhere within the catchment of that river. So we need material that we have a good, precise, strong hold on the context of that material. So these deposits, they can be quite challenging to identify because they're so localized in extent, and we recover these mainly through boreholes. And some of these are split and recorded in the field. You can see on the bottom of this image, this is one of the cores from one of our sites that's just been split in the field and that we've recorded. And we've identified peat from a number of locations along the route. So this is one of our sites at Bicken Hill. It's a little bit to the south of Birmingham, and actually it was in a previous archaeological evaluation that they identified an area of peat in a trench, and this isn't something that we'd picked up in our earlier work because there weren't many boreholes from this area, so it really hadn't figured in our earlier phases of investigation. But we're very flexible to these changes. So when sites come up and it looks like they have a geoarchaeological potential, we can add it into the program. So we developed a borehole transect in this area that extended beyond where the peat had been identified in this trench, but we wanted to understand whether this was a deposit that was more localized in extent or was present across larger parts of the floodplain. So in the event, we actually only found it in 2 of the 14 cores that we did in this site, and we have around about 1/2 meter of peat that's resting on outwash gravels. Those outwash gravels would have been from the last ice age. Now, 1/2 meter of peat might not sound much. It's not as exciting as finding some nice swanky find on an archaeological site. And as a rule of thumb, we usually work on the basis of about 1,000 years per meter of peat. So on that basis, we might be dealing with 500 meters of peat, but there's a lot of variation in how these deposits form. And these small river valleys, these small watercourses, have really been, in general, overlooked in the past in favour of the large river valleys where we have extensive deposits formed. And these small river valleys have real potential to contain paleoenvironmental archives that can help us to understand past environment. So although we might have only a few hundred or 1,000 or so years of peat formation here, it's a record that we didn't have before from this landscape, and it can add to the knowledge base. And the other site that I want to briefly mention here is Coles Hill. So there have been earlier presentations on Coles Hill on the archaeological mitigation works that have been going on here. A lot of Bronze Age archaeology here. And this is located just to the east of Birmingham. And here the excavations have located a series of courses of former channels that we call paleochannels. So these are formerly active channels that have infilled with sediment and become inactive. And these channels are closely associated with the archaeology that we have from the site. So there are Bronze Age burnt mounds, there are post hole alignments. So there's a very real potential here to produce environmental data from these channels that is contemporary with the human activity and that we can help to inform on. And we often find these paleochannels preserved in river landscapes, particularly during periods where rivers are more active. So during the Holocene, and I was talking about this for the Bronze Age and later periods, we see a lot of changes in riverine environments that are associated with climate fluctuations and changes in human land use. And these generally happen as a result of increased sedimentation into rivers. So in these slides, these are some extreme examples. Actually, in this slide here, this is, I should have mentioned that the paleochannel here is visible as this sort of arc of coloured in beige. We have a number of boreholes from this, but also slots that have been placed across it to take samples from it. And you can see on this slide, we've got, you can see with my cursor, an area of peat that was identified here. This is the present day channel of the River Cole. And then the terrace deposits, the Pleistocene deposits, and then deposits of the previous floodplain preserved here. But where we have this increased riverine activity or fluvial activity, it's a result of changes in human land use and climate. So there's some very extreme examples here. So if you clear woodland and use that land for agriculture, it leads to a lot of soil stability, or it can lead to a lot of soil stability. And that soil, particularly on slopes, can be eroded downslope, and where there's rivers, that's then carried into the river systems and through and deposited across the floodplains and through these channels. So the image that you can see here is not actually from the UK, it's from the rainforest area. And it's a very extreme example. And just here in these rainforest areas, the soils don't have a lot of clay binding the sediment together. So you can find in these situations, you get huge erosion of woodland soils during single rainfall events. I'm not suggesting it would have been like that in the UK at all, but it's that same sort of process of material being washed into rivers and then deposited through the catchment. And you'll also get flooding events. So this is actually I think the Mississippi during a flooding event, and you can see the massive change that you get between the normal channel and where and the floodplain of the river during flooding episodes. So we would have had that at points in the past, and this can reactivate older channels and create new channels as well, which then become infilled with sediment, and then those are sealed by the alluvium that spreads across the floodplain. And then you can have later channels cutting through those deposits from later periods that again infill. And so you can get, as this slide in the top left shows, quite complex sort of patterns of older channels preserved between the floodplain. So if you look at a floodplain of a river today, most of these are actually built on or agricultural land behind flood defences, but that flat, seemingly uninteresting landscape can actually hide quite a complex past environment, and was an environment that was free for exploitation by past communities. So these are highly dynamic environments. They record changes that we can understand in terms of past human activity and climate change, and that would have been past changes in the physical landscape. So that's a very brief overview of what we're trying to do with the Holocene material. It will become a lot clearer when we have the opportunity to actually start investigating some of this material. And so this leads me to my last slide here. What are we going to do next with this? Well, when we finish the field work, the next part for us is to write a report that details the results of that field work, but it will include our recommendations for the sequences of material that we want to examine in the laboratory and to assess. And that will be to assess its potential to then carry on through into analysis. So we'll have these cores and other samples open in the laboratory. We'll take subsamples from them. We'll use the information that we have from all of these trial pits and boreholes to produce updated models of the sediment. And then we'll actually get all of these samples prepared, and things that we can look at under the microscope and look at their potential for further work. So we are, despite the amount of work that we've done, still at a relatively early stage in the process, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity for us to repeat this talk today and start to provide a little bit of information on the actual material that we're taking from the sites. Thank you very much.
Well, that was really interesting, and I'm very happy to say we've got both Alex and Andy here on the line to answer some of your questions. Chaps, are you both there?
Yes.
I am indeed. Hello.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So we've had a couple of questions come in. The first question is about a deposit. What does that word actually mean? Sally was asking, the term deposit sounds like small quantities, but does it actually indicate sort of stratigraphy and layers in the ground, or is it different altogether?
Do you want to cover this, Andy?
Yeah, I can do that. So basically, the term deposit just literally means to some sediments, and usually you're talking sediments in quantity. So a particular deposit is a term about. Usually you're talking about how a deposit was laid down. So it could be a river gravel, or it could be material that's been transported down slope. So a slope deposit material which has been reworked by gravity down slope. So it's more a catch-all term. In terms of size, you're usually talking about larger amounts of material.
Thank you very much. And another question we've had is if, and I'm not sure which particular period this refers to, but the question is about kind of representative samples and what do we compare it against? So how can we make judgments about whether something we find reflects what we already know, or represents something we don't know if we don't have things to compare it to?
I think that's actually quite a good question. It will depend on the period, I think, and the type of material we're looking at. I think for some things it may not be a representative sample, and I think we just, we may have very little to compare it against, but I think we just have to be honest about it in those situations. And I think we just couch our conclusions on that basis, and then as part of that process of science and discovery, as new material is revealed in the future, people can take the work that we've done and update it. I suppose it's quite an issue for the Pleistocene as well, isn't it, Andy, in terms of like the amount of Paleolithic material we've got as well.
I think a key thing with that is chronology. So if we can understand the period which something dates to, we can compare that to other environmental records from both within the local area, so that could be the river valley system that you're dealing with, or across Britain. So and within that you could end up with records which relate to periods where we have, particularly with the Pleistocene, we have very little evidence, so it could be entirely new and telling us something completely different. So I think the key thing with that is to know how old something is.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, chaps. I mean, there's no other questions. So do you have any kind of closing thoughts to round out the session?
I think from my perspective that my thoughts are really just trying to get all the field work done and starting to actually progress with the actual laboratory work. That I think is you know, the next interesting part of the process from my perspective. And then we'll have like Andy was saying, we'll have a better understanding of the dates of these things. We'll be able to refine the sorts of questions we're asking and actually starting to produce some more concrete data, I think, and we'll have something a little bit more refined to report on, I think, as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you both for taking time on a Saturday to call in. We all really appreciate that.
Yep,
thank you very much, chaps. And everyone else, our next session is shortly to begin on the finds of HS2, and I'll be starting that session any minute now. Thanks for coming along, everyone. Goodbye.